Chapter 3. The Spry Senior. A pair of scarlet-skinned demons dragged a man out of a hidden room and placed him in the center of Idin's chambers. Idin sat on his massive throne, examining the man. 5 had funded a new sanctuary for Idin to command his own division of Lylin as the new keeper of Wrath. "Who's this?" Idin shouted. "Oh, Overlord," a demon replied. "This is Andy Barnes. He was caught spreading propaganda and tried converting our own to castatus. He locked eyes with Andy, a double agent." Without hesitation, the minion nodded. Idin shot out of his chair and loomed over the traitor. He used his demonic power to crack into Andy's mind and file through his memories. Andy tried to resist, but drowned in Idin's labyrinth of mind games. Idin released him as he paced back and forth. "So, you preach the word of your gods while they leave you unprotected. Is that right?" "Oh shit," Andy shouted. "Fuck, please, I only worship you." Idin patted his head like a dog. "You've spoken with Uriel. You have been praised and gifted priceless relics for helping them. I could say the same for Michael. They've clearly been generous to you." Tears trickled down Andy's face. Idin turned to his minions. "Your girlfriend cheated on you, but you chose to be a cowardly cuckold. A fat piece of trash. You are someone who always thinks they are right, and when you are called out on your fuckwit logic, you freeze. I'm not going to kill you, Andy. You're going to be our house pet." Andy loudly wept into his hands. Idin knelt next to him and whispered in his ear, "You have your own cock so far down your own throat, and still, you're not choking. You're a freak of nature. Your new gods have been nice to you, but I won't." With fire in his demonic eyes, Idin cut his wrist and covered the wound as he hovered it over Andy's head. Blood leaked through Idin's fingers, dripping onto Andy's forehead. It trickled down his face and streamed into his mouth. The wound on his wrist healed instantly. He looked at Andy with a demented glare and ambled to his throne. "Skin him alive and use the mimic to warp his brain. Do it in front of me," Idin explained. "I want to witness the moment his hope crumbles." Tears streamed down Andy's face. "No, stop." Idin made the shape of a gun with his right hand and pointed it at the ceiling. "Okay, Andy, get the fuck out of here." Andy wiped the tears from his eyes and lifted the inside corners of his brows. "Really?" Idin's hand remained pointed at the ceiling. "Fuck no, little Andy. To the rest of the world, consider yourself dead." Andy buried his face into his hands and hysterically wept. Idin lifted his brows as he pouted his lips. "Don't worry, Andy Bobandy. My blood will keep you alive through all of this. That's the best part." A pair of demons grabbed Andy's hands and pierced through them with sharp hooks that connected to the ceiling. Andy spat out a mouthful of saliva as he gasped in pain. The minions used a chain binder that clanked and rattled as its grip tightened. A demon used their saw-like hands to hack off both of Andy's legs. Another demon grabbed a fire-hot instrument to cauterize the wounds. Andy looked down at his dismembered legs and projectile vomited onto the floor. The blood he drank was infinitely stronger than morphine. A perfect cocktail of the strongest drugs in the world couldn't get Andy this high. Idin sat on his throne and watched. A spider-like creature known as a mimic quickly squirmed as it slowly crawled on its legs. It was a horrifying creature that looked like an oversized spider who bred with a crab, a sort of twisted evolution warped by cruel nature. It had leathery bright brown skin with 6 pointy legs that connected to its abdomen. There was a pulsating growth on its stomach where its 10 tiny jet black eyeballs were located. The mimic loomed over Andy and used its telepathic power to hijack his mind. Kaleidoscope-like patterns filled the mimic's eyes. Andy's desperate cries for help suddenly ceased. The mimic crawled away and let Andy stare at the wall with a gleeful disposition. Vomit and saliva drooled out of his mouth. Symmetrical geographic patterns flooded his eyes and warped his brain. Aiden's minions grabbed a tool belt from a rolling rack and proceeded to scalp his head. Blood slowly beaded down his face. It didn't take long before a stream of blood poured over Andy's face and pooled onto the floor. All anyone heard was the loud splatter of blood. Aiden watched with a pearly grin. "We received the due rewards of our deeds," he said in Latin. He turned to his demonic guards and waved his hand. "I've seen enough. Take him to the basement. You can continue your fun down there." In his beast form, Seven hung upside down from the ceiling and ate candy from his brown paper bag. "Finally, I'm fucking bored." Aiden watched his minions drag the happy and blissful Andy out of the room. Blood oozed out of his open wounds, leaving a trail wherever he went. Aiden turned to Seven with narrowed brows. "You sound like a 5-year-old. Seven cackled as he dropped from the ceiling. His hulking body slammed onto the floor, leaving it cracked and broken. He morphed into a human and followed Aiden to his car. Aiden used his car remote to unlock his Koenigsegg Gemera, then hopped inside. Seven reached for his brown paper bag and enjoyed his beloved candy. Aiden rolled the windows down and turned the stereo on. Music blared out of the car as they drove through the city. He enjoyed watching the road as the streetlights shined over the windshield. He and Seven didn't speak a word during the car ride. Aiden checked his phone after receiving a message. It read, "Can you meet me at the Blue Fox, Megan?" Heart emoji. He placed his phone on his lap and made a U-turn. Seven turned to him with a grin on his face and ate a piece of candy. "I wonder what she wants, kiddo." Aiden glanced at Seven with a blank face and focused on the road. Seven stared at him with a broad smile. Aiden parked his car across the street from the Blue Fox and strolled to the pub. Once he entered, Megan was the first person he saw. She sat at the bar, neck deep in her Moscow Mule. Aiden stood next to her and grabbed a bar stool. He gave the bartender a restless look. "Can I get what she's having, please?" Music played out of the bar speakers. They were engulfed in the loud music and chatter of patrons. Megan stared at her drink as she rhythmically tapped her copper cup. "Hey," she whimpered. Aiden turned to her, wrapping his hand around his copper cup. "Do you need something?" Megan turned to him with watery eyes. "You've been so cold to me. Did I do something wrong?" Aiden looked down at his cup and stared into the dark pool of his drink. "I've been distant from everyone. Being trapped down there for a minute is a lifetime. I don't expect you to understand." Megan stared at the half-empty bottles of spirits by the bar. Aiden drank from his copper cup and watched the television screen. "Why the fuck do they give you this shit when you expect a real copper cup? How stupid do they think I am?" Seven stood next to Aiden and patted himself down. "Well, this is awkward. I'm gonna go get some candy." Aiden turned to Megan with narrowed brows. "I need space. I'm dealing with things I can't explain. My brain is running a mile a minute in all directions. I don't know where to begin. I want to kill myself, but what will happen to me once I'm dead? I feel like I'm in a microwave. I want to die, but I also want to live forever." Megan used a napkin to wipe her nose, then turned to him, gazing into his eyes. "You don't have to explain yourself. Can't we talk? I just want to help you. I'm always here for you." Aiden slammed his hands on the bar countertop. Patrons turned to them, shocked and concerned. A man approached Megan with a smirk. "Hey, my name's Gordon. Is this guy bothering you?" Megan curved her frown into a warm smile. No, he's a friend of mine. I'm okay, thank you. Gordon glanced at Aiden. He had already been glaring back at him. Gordon looked back at Megan with a lopsided grin. Okay. Well, I'll be over there if you need me, he said, and walked to his table. Aiden watched until he sat in his corner. Gordon winked the second they locked eyes. Aiden turned to the bar and held his copper cup on the dirty, wooden countertop. My experience down there ruined me. I saw too much. There's no going back. I have to figure out how to live like a human again. Megan stared at her copper cup with watery eyes, then caressed his left cheek as she gazed into his eyes. But you are human. Do you know how much time you need? Aiden closed his eyes and let out a pronounced sigh. No, I just need to be alone. Her eyes welled up, and she turned to her copper cup. Right, you have my number. Talk to me when you're ready. Let me pay for yours, he said, then raised the bottom of his cup in the air, drinking the last of it. He slammed the cup onto the countertop, threw a few bills next to it, and walked out of the pub. He crossed the street and ambled past Seven, who gleefully ate his assorted candy. You should have a cigarette, kiddo, Seven said, on his way to the car. You may as well start your long list of addictions now. Blow off some steam. Aiden sat in the driver's seat and turned to him. Seven stared back. I hope you shit yourself once you're fresh out of the shower and have already gotten ready for work. Seven's nose wrinkled as he cackled in his seat. Aiden pulled away from the curb and drove through the city. Music played out of the stereo. Aiden pulled into the driveway of the mansion and parked his car behind the house. Once inside, he saw 6 and 3 watching television on one of the living room couches. Seven stared at the back of Aiden's head with a brow raised. Where are we going, kiddo? Aiden traversed the massive house on his way to the basement. He took his final step into the room, and the lights automatically turned on. They briefly flickered before illuminating the massive room that was covered with ivory white panels. Aiden pressed a series of buttons on the garage panel and brought his Kawasaki ZX6 motorcycle out of storage in the wall. He reached for the scabbard on the back of his red plaid jacket and unsathed Snolligoster. Before sitting on the bike, he pressed a few buttons and released a squad of robots. The ivory white panels turned jet black. Aiden revved the bike engine and glared at the robots who defended themselves. Seven watched as he ate his candy. Music blared out of the room's stereo system. Neon red lights illuminated Aiden's path. He gritted his teeth and raced toward the robots as they quickly scattered throughout the room. Seven leaned against the wall by the staircase and continued to watch. The robots closest to Aiden surged to the ceiling and ran across it with their sharp iron claws. Their heads turned into powerful turrets that fired .950 JDJ rounds with red tracer ammunition, creating beams of light. Aiden used a new skill, slowing time down with his mind. He held Snolligoster in front of his body and deflected any bullets that were sure to hit him. He took his time watching the adjacent bullets fly by. After the final wave of bullets passed, time sped back up. The robots on the ground changed their arms into Nodaki swords and charged toward him. Aiden ducked underneath one of the arms and used Snolligoster to slice its body in half. He floored the bike down the massive garage. One by one, he defeated each of them and came to a screeching halt once he reached the end of the room. A robot came out of hiding and attacked him from behind. Its swords instantly shattered over the back of his head. Aiden looked over his shoulder and fired his gun until it overheated. The robot seized up as it collapsed onto the floor. Soon after, its glowing green eyes burned out. Seven grimaced as he popped a piece of candy into his mouth. You are getting sloppy, kiddo. Aiden scowled as he examined the room. I wasn't good enough. Where was it hiding? I thought I got all of them. He touched the back of his head and saw blood on his fingertips. The jet-black panels turned ivory white, illuminating the room with bright lights. His right leg vibrated. He pulled his phone out to read the message. It read, "What's good, bro? I need to talk to you, see?" Aiden made his way to the staircase. "Stay here. I'm going to pay Charlie a visit." Seven folded the top of his bag and followed him to the living room. "Sure, why not?" Aiden sat in his car. He grabbed the steering wheel with both hands and took a deep breath before driving to Charlie's house. The beautiful, sunny day was just what he needed. Once Aiden arrived, he texted Charlie and honked the horn. Charlie hopped out of the front door, waving to Aiden. On his way to the car, he opened the door and sat next to Aiden. "What's up?" Aiden looked over the steering wheel and started driving. "Hey, Charlie." Charlie glanced at him with knitted brows. "Let's get dinner or something." Aiden nodded as he focused on the road. He pulled into the Bernie's Diner parking lot, and they walked inside. Charlie picked a booth, and they ordered coffee. Music softly played through the speakers. Charlie took a sip from his cup as he raised the inside corners of his brows. "How are you feeling?" Aiden took a sip from his cup and looked through the window next to them. "I wish I knew exactly what I was getting into. I feel like I was set up for failure. I could have been trapped down there for a lot longer than 42 years. Charlie leaned closer as he squinted his eyes. "If you don't want to tell me, I understand. But what did you see?" Aiden leaned into his chair and stared at the ceiling. He refrained from telling Charlie of their conflict. "I had to kill my mom and dad. Demonic children. A horrifying woman with disgusting, saggy tits. I was forced to watch Megan do unspeakable things to hurt me in every way possible. The experience was ineffable. It's been burned into my brain forever." Charlie sipped his coffee and stared at the table with knitted brows. I'm sorry." Aiden nodded and looked through the window once again. Charlie knew something was terribly wrong once he spotted the dark circles under his eyes. "Thank you for keeping this to yourself," Aiden said, staring into his shallow cup. "I don't know if anyone would take you seriously, but I'm still grateful for having someone to talk to." "Don't sweat it, Aiden," he replied. "I'll always be here for you. I promise." Aiden lifted the inside corners of his brows. "I don't ever want to go back. I didn't understand the point of going there until I was out. I love how strong I am, like attention to a whore, but the price for it is too high." Charlie squinted his eyes and drew his brows together. "What happened with Megan?" Aiden's glazed eyes filled with tears. "I was chained to a wall and was forced to watch you, Griffith, and my father fuck the shit out of her. Was that the answer you were looking for?" Almost spilling the rest of his coffee onto himself, Charlie gaped at him. He grabbed the napkin next to him and cleaned the mess on the diner tabletop. "Gross. I'm not even into women. Even if I was, I wouldn't have it in me to mess with Megan." Aiden took a sip from his cup as they locked eyes. "I wish I could do something for you," Charlie said, sipping from his cup. "I don't know how I'd handle seeing the person I care about the most do something like that to me. You're stronger than me, that's for sure. I'd probably off myself or drown in alcohol. I'm a coward." Aiden drank the rest of his coffee and placed the cup at the end of the table. "It filled me with doubt, but the devil watches over his own." Charlie slightly cocked his head to the right. "What do you mean?" Aiden stared at his hands before looking back at Charlie. "The man you see before you isn't the boy you saw at his father's funeral." Charlie awkwardly stared at him. Aiden pushed himself out of his seat and materialized Snologosta in his right hand. Charlie marveled at the sight of his sword. With a sinister glare, I then swiftly decapitated him with it. He watched Charlie's head roll onto the table, knocking over his cup of coffee, and eventually hitting his feet on the diner floor. I then stared at his head, baring his hellish fangs with an ominous grin. Charlie's cold eyes locked with his. "Aiden," he said. "Aiden, are you okay?" Aiden shook his head and opened his eyes. He was suddenly sitting across from Charlie in the diner booth, who still had his head and was in perfect health. Aiden promptly nodded. Charlie gave him a gentle smile. They finished their meals and left an excessive tip for the waitress. Once they left, Aiden pulled away from the curb and drove through the city. Music blared out of the stereo. Aiden and Charlie watched as men and women walked the streets. Lylin and Nephilim stared back at Aiden, but Charlie was none the wiser. Charlie stared at his shoes and pondered. "She loves you, Aiden." Without hesitation, Aiden nodded. "I know." Charlie watched him in his peripheral vision. "She texted me saying she met a guy. I told her I wanted a break from everyone." Aiden replied. Charlie turned to him with squinted eyes. "Why are you talking to me then?" "I don't know," Aiden replied. "I feel like I had to tell someone." Charlie looked through his window and scowled. "You should have told her instead." Aiden focused on the road and watched the street lights shine over the windshield. He parked the car in front of Charlie's home. Charlie waved. Aiden nodded. Charlie hopped out of the car and entered his home. The faint sound of Megan crying for help suddenly lingered. Aiden popped his head out of the car and looked in her direction. She screamed at the top of her lungs. He immediately made a U-turn, hammered his foot down, and drove back to his house in a blind panic. He grabbed his bike out of the garage and stared at the ground as he focused on her voice once more. "Aiden," she cried. He managed to pinpoint her exact location and hopped onto his motorcycle. He gritted his teeth while racing toward her. The black hoodie that was knitted into his red plaid jacket clouded his face. Her voice grew louder the closer he became. Megan laid on an apartment floor, bloodied and covered with contusions. Her face and limbs had gashes with blood that trickled down her body. With signs of great struggle, she was covered in various bodily fluids. "Ha ha ha," Gordon cackled. "This whore has had enough dick for now. Why don't we pick this up in, say, 20 minutes? His friends nodded as they laughed in unison. Megan remained emotionless and empty on the tiled floor. She stared at the ceiling, mumbling incoherent gibberish. Moments later, Aiden flew through a window as he remained seated on his motorcycle. He effortlessly jumped off of the bike, running over one of them. Gordon and his goons shrieked. Aiden unsathed Snologosta and pointed his sword at the men who dared touch his beloved. "How the fuck did you get in here?" Gordon asked. "We're 8 stories up." Aiden morphed into a terrifying demon as he glared at them. 2 sharp, pointy horns erected out of his head. His glowing red and yellow demonic eyes had bilateral meiosis. He knitted his brows and pointed his scarlet-skinned index finger at Gordon. "You!" he shouted. Gordon's lips quivered as he urinated his pants. Aiden launched toward him, thrusting the wrath of Snologosta through his chest. Before anyone could blink, he tackled Gordon onto the tiled floor. His sword went through the floor and into the lower level. A faint shriek came from the floor below them. Aiden twisted the hilt and ripped his sword out of Gordon's chest, tearing his body in half. He hovered his hand over Gordon's horrified face and fired a powerful pulse, exploding his head. Aiden turned and glared at Gordon's friends. They stared back and screamed in terror. Aiden took a deep breath and ambled toward them. The men howled for help as they tried to run. One of them stared at Aiden for far too long and tripped out of an open apartment window plummeting to his death. Another man ran for the front door in an attempt to swiftly flee. I then used his mind to alter details in the apartment. The man bashed into the front door as fast as he could, slamming his shoulder and head into it. The wooden door had turned to stone just before impact. The man's skull split, and he died instantly. I then locked eyes with the last man and pierced into his soul with a razor-sharp glare. He slightly cocked his head to the right and went into a back right stance as he clutched the hilt of Snonagosta. The man shouted and charged at the zealous demon in a last resort for freedom. I then grabbed an empty glass and threw it at his head. The man screamed and wiped his bloody face as he sat next to a beam in the middle of the room. I then furiously kicked a table, shoving it toward him. The edge of the table flew into his face, snapping his neck. I then turned to Megan and loomed her. He morphed into a human as his rage melted away. Tears trickled down his face and landed on hers. She laid on the floor, lifeless and unresponsive. Her face was swollen, barely making it possible to see. Just like his knees, Aiden's heart dropped to the floor. He took a moment to gather himself before carefully picking her up. Megan's broken wrists cracked when her arms swayed back and forth. Aiden created an onyx black portal with his mind. He examined the room and marveled at his carnage, then turned to the portal and ambled through it with her carefully placed in his arms. Before he could blink, they were safely inside Six's living room. I then glanced at Seven with moist eyes. "Get my bike," he screamed. Seven promptly teleported out of the living room. Six turned to Aiden and Megan with a raised brow. "What happened, boy?" Aiden's chin trembled as he stared at Megan's swollen face. "They fucking essayed her," he cried. Six stood behind him as he looked at his siblings with a rictus grin. "Get her on the couch, son. Asmodeus, get a blanket for the poor girl." Megan writhed as she reached out for help. She was sweating profusely. I then turned to the keepers, staring at them. "What the fuck? What do I do?" Three rushed over to Megan and covered her body with a thick blanket. "Fuck!" I then shouted. After parking Aiden's bike in the garage, Seven sat on the second-floor balcony and watched with a bag of candy on his lap. Megan was far too cross-faded to muster a coherent thought. She gasped for air as she aimlessly looked around the room. "We need Tristatia here," Six said as he searched for his phone. He would know what to do. I then dotted a glance between Six and Megan. She squeezed her eyes shut and gritted her teeth, moaning due to involuntary spasms. Her complexion worsened as time passed. I then used Snonagosta to carve a gash in his wrist. Seven watched with a broad smile. He was so focused on Aiden that he dropped a piece of candy from the second floor. Aiden poured his blood into Megan's mouth. Six turned to Seven with narrowed brows. He looked back at Aiden and cocked his head to the right. What are you doing, Aiden?" Aiden stared at Megan as he wiped the blood from his wrist. "I'm saving her." He pushed himself off the couch and stepped backward. Everyone in the room froze as they watched. Suddenly, Megan violently squirmed on the couch. She threw her arms in the air and snapped her wrists back into place. Her eyes rolled to the back of her head. Her skin was no longer pale and had a vibrant glow to it. Her knuckles and fingers cracked and popped. The cuts and gashes that covered her body healed instantly. Her eyes rolled back with a flurry of red and yellow in them. I then gently held her face as they looked into the eyes of each other. Her eyes slowly faded back to hazel as she gasped for air and grabbed his arms. "Megan!" I then whimpered. Megan started crying, and they wept in each other's arms. "I was trapped down there for so long," she whimpered. "The things I saw. Is this real? Am I really here? I found that stupid clown. I don't ever want to go back." I then wiped her tears and caressed her face. "You're out now. This is real. You are safe, I promise. I met Thanatos, she cried. I died so many times. He laughed at me so many times. I'm here, Megan, Iden replied. You have me now. Six chewed on his lip as he glared at them, clenching his fists. He walked out of the room. Look at what your pet did, Ira. This wasn't part of the plan. Seven glanced at him with a mouthful of candy. Oh, yeah. That sucks. I don't want to live anymore, Megan whimpered. I can't do this. I then picked her up and carried her to his room. You can lean on me from now on. Take it easy and rest for a while. At that moment, a part of Iden's sanity came back to life. It was a warm and welcoming feeling that he yearned for. Once they lay down on his bed, Megan buried her face into his chest. Don't leave me again. Iden gently stroked his fingers through her hair. I won't, I promise. Megan wrapped her arms around him and violently cried. Iden stayed awake until she was drained of tears and passed out. He gently tucked himself in and fell asleep next to her. In the middle of the night, he woke up. He looked at Megan, who was fast asleep, and smirked. He slowly made his way out of bed and turned to her. He heard nothing but crickets and dead air in the late hours of the night. Iden suddenly raised his right arm in the air and materialized Snologosta into the palm of his hand. He took a deep breath and quickly thrust his sword through her chest. Megan gasped and reached out to him. He realized what he had done, and his eyes broadened. Her moist, protruding eyes stared at him before her soul faded, giving her final breath. Iden froze as he loomed over her blood-soaked body and forgot to breathe. Moments later, he took a deep breath and closed his eyes. This can't be happening. This isn't me. Seven ambled of the shadows, laughing hysterically as he filed through the candy in his brown paper bag. Iden kept his eyes closed and counted out loud. This isn't real. 1, 2. Seven glared at him with an ominous grin. This is as real as it fucking gets, kiddo. Iden squeezed his eyes shut. 3. He whispered as he violently shook his head. 4, 5. 6. 7. He reopened his eyes and found himself looming over Megan. 7 was gone. She was tucked into her side of the bed and was perfectly fine. Iden made his sword vanish and spent the rest of the night walking through the neighborhood. The next morning, Megan woke up and noticed Iden had gone missing. She sat up and quickly changed into the clothes that were laid out for her. She walked out of the bedroom and saw Iden talking to an imaginary person while he cooked breakfast in the kitchen. In her reborn state, Megan's vision was incredibly clear and vibrant. She had never felt so happy and strong in her entire life. She focused her mind and froze time. She saw a fly from across the room and examined it in great detail. Megan glanced at Iden and could smell his natural scent from across the house. The smell of him felt like home. She closed her eyes and savored the thought of him. Megan! Iden shouted, "Come get some breakfast." She turned to him and made her way to the kitchen, then sat on a stool next to the island in the middle. Iden turned to her with a closed-lip smile. "I made some eggs and bacon for you. I haven't craved food since my experience, but I made some for you, in case you were hungry." Megan looked at the food and covered her mouth with her hand. "Yeah, no thanks." Iden chucked the food into the garbage with a gentle smile. "Yeah, I thought so. The change has already taken effect." "I understand now," Megan said. Iden placed the dishes into the washer and looked at her with knitted brows. "I'm not going to ask what you had to go through," he said, cleaning the kitchen counter. "Making you relive that would be cruel." I don't want to go back either. Megan lowered her eyebrows and chewed on her lip. Well, I'll tell you one of them. My first trial. Aiden raised his index finger, interrupting her. Hold that thought. Let's get some fresh air and go for a drive. They hopped into Aiden's car, and he turned it on. Music played out of the speakers. He pulled out of the driveway and drove into the city. Megan watched the birds chirp and marveled at their beauty. I was forced into the same psych ward as my father. There were man-eating spiders that lived in his head. They eventually clawed their way out and ran at me. I died 17 different times during the trial. I counted. Seeing piles of my corpses really fucked me up. I then glanced at her and watched the road. Megan looked out of the window, hiding her one face. In my trials, it took everything I loved and bastardized the idea of them. I then explained. They were used against me. Megan turned to him with arched eyebrows. Yes, exactly, she replied. I have a question for you, she asked. I then glanced at her once again. Sure, shoot it at me. Megan stared at him with knitted brows. There was a man who helped me down there. Said you and him were good friends. He looked like a private investigator or something. He flashed his badge, but it was too fast to read his name. Do you know who he is? I then pulled next to the curb before he stared at her. Several minutes passed before anyone said a word. That man you speak of never helped me, he replied. I don't have a clue who he is. Megan scratched her head and looked out of her window. I then focused on the road and pulled away from the curb. I don't want to do this to him, but I need to send Charlie there too. Megan's face went pale. No, fuck that. What's wrong with you? You almost died before you drank my blood. I then replied. What if something bad happens and I'm not around to save him? Megan stared at him with bulging eyes. No. I then clenched his jaw as he watched the road. I already texted him. Megan, we're almost there. Megan stared at him with an icy glare. It took me 67 years to get out. We're not putting him through that. I then stopped the car and stared at her once again. Without a single blink, she stared back. He drove to a secluded area, kicked her out of the car, and turned the engine off. Once he was out of the car, he stared at his watch as he talked to her. I know I can't change your mind with words. Get your anger out and let's be done with it. Megan stared at the ground and pondered. I don't want to hurt you, but I'm not going to let you hurt Charlie. He's too innocent. I then stared at her with a blank face. A massive red cloud emanated from Megan's body, swallowing her whole. Moments later, she swiftly launched out of it in her demon form. Her glowing red and yellow eyes illuminated her face. Her long and thick tail had a razor-sharp blade protruding out of the tip and hung above her head like a scorpion. Her hands grew long, sharp onyx black talons with ultra-thick, hardened skin, infinitely stronger than any man-made armor. She tackled Aiden halfway through his transformation, trying to gain the upper hand. They both stood onto their feet, giving each other piercing glares. Their thoughts were one. Megan snapped her tail, sending him airborne. Aiden slammed onto the ground and looked up at her. She surged into the air and descended toward him. Aiden rolled to his knees and kicked her in the face. She twirled several times before landing on the ground. Dust and debris clouded both of them for several minutes. I then watched her damaged face recover. The dust finally faded. She charged at him with gritted teeth and open talons. She furiously launched her tail toward him. He ducked underneath her razor-sharp claws and drop-kicked her shins. She promptly face-planted into the dry dirt and slowly looked at him in defeat. The ultra-thick skin on her face crumbled to the ground. Okay, she said. Fine, let's get Charlie. Aiden stretched as he watched her stand up. Megan morphed back into a human, glowering at him while red in the face. Shut the fuck up. Aiden stared back with knitted brows. I didn't say anything. Kill her now, the voices whispered. She will abandon you. She will jump. Aiden shrugged it off and walked to his car. A man hid in the bushes while he watched from afar. He grabbed his two-way radio and spoke into it. This is Detective Snow. No longer 10 to 80. Currently 100 and C and 106. Over. Aiden and Megan sat in the car and drove off. Snow carefully ambled to the scene. Holy shit, he whispered and grabbed his two-way radio once again. 10:23. Hillside of Rouge National Urban Park. He examined the area as he continued to speak into the radio. 10:25. Do not use lights or sirens. He continued his investigation while he waited for a response. 10:04. Sending units, an agent replied. Snow watched as a Koenigsegg Gemera raced off into the distance. Aiden parked his car next to the curb and followed Megan to the front door. She knocked twice as she scowled at Aiden. I can't believe we're doing this. This is so stupid. Aiden arched his head back and stared at the sunny sky. It's for his own good. Megan flared her nostrils. You're acting like some shitty dad who forced his son into being a doctor. He can't just live with us. Aiden turned to her with knitted brows. There's going to be a time when we're not around, and it's fight or flight. Megan let out a pronounced sigh. God damn it. Aiden nodded. God damn it, indeed. Look at how far you've come. You're like a nascent star. I want the same for our dear friend, Charlie. Charlie opened the door with a warm smile. Megan. He cheered. Oh my goodness, I'm so happy to see you. Charlie. His mother shouted. Keep it down. He quickly looked over his shoulder. Sorry, Mama. He replied as he closed the door behind him. Megan glanced at Aiden and looked back at Charlie. I feel lucky to be here. Charlie pointed at her with his index finger. I'm very excited you're still with us, bitch. You're not allowed to leave again. Megan smacked as she nodded. Charlie looked at them with a quizzical smile. So, why are we here today? It's kind of early, don't you think? I'm here to save you, Charles, Aiden replied. Charlie cocked his head. What do you mean, new bold? Megan burst into laughter. New bold. Aiden looked at Charlie with a blank face. I want you to drink my blood. Charlie covered his mouth with both hands. Ew, no. Just no. Megan turned to Aiden with raised brows. I told you this wasn't a good idea. Aiden stared at the ground as he nodded. Maybe you're right. He's probably too gay and black to survive it anyway. Too much of a pussy. Charlie clenched his jaw and waved his finger in Aiden's face. Hold up, you fucking honky. Aiden and Megan glanced at each other before looking back at Charlie. Fine, you stupid idiot. Charlie shouted. I'll do it. Aiden and Megan glanced at each other once more. Charlie walked into his house and closed the door behind him. Aiden puckered his lips while he stared at his car. Megan played with her nails and looked at the doormat. Moments later, Charlie's mother came to the door wearing a broad smile. Oh, hey, how are you doing? Hey, Miss Scott. Aiden and Megan said in unison. Can Charlie come out and play? Aiden asked. Megan looked away and tried to hide her laughter with her hands. Let me go get him, baby, Miss Scott replied. She locked eyes with him, pointing at him with her index finger. Take care of my boy, now, or I'm going to kick your motherfucking ass. Aiden nodded. You have my word, Miss Scott. I'll bring my ass straight here if anything bad happens. Miss Scott nodded back as she walked into her home. Good, I'll go get him. Aiden waited with his left foot on the first step, while he stared at the ground. Megan pulled her phone out and texted. Minutes later, Charlie walked past them. "All right, give me your juice, or whatever the fuck you talked about." Aiden and Megan followed Charlie to the car and got in. Aiden fired up the engine and drove through the city. Music played through the car speakers. Aiden pulled into the driveway of the mansion, and they entered the house. 2 was watching an episode of The Demon's Den. The 3 of them walked past her on their way to Aiden's room. 6 and 7 quietly spoke to each other as they watched the group traverse the house. Charlie and Megan sat on Aiden's bed and watched him close the door. "Are you ready, Charlie?" Aiden asked. Charlie glanced at Aiden and stared at the floor by his feet. "Yeah, I guess so." Megan placed her hand on his lap. "You're gonna see some fucked up shit." "Like what?" Charlie asked. Aiden stepped forward and looked at Charlie with a blank face. "In order for me to continue, you had to die." Charlie stared at him with bulging eyes. Moments later, his right eye twitched. Megan patted his knee with a tight-lipped smile. "Yeah, we know. You'll be out for about a minute or so for us, but you might be down there for a bit longer," Aiden explained. Megan stared at Charlie with broadened eyes. "Maybe 67 years." Charlie aimlessly stared at the wooden floor. Fuck. Aiden ambled toward him. "Lay down and loosen up. I know you'll be fine." Megan used Charlie's knee to push herself off the bed and stood next to Aiden. Charlie lay down and closed his eyes. "Are you ready?" Aiden asked. Charlie squeezed his eyes shut and gritted his teeth. "Just fucking do it." Aiden used one of Megan's knives to cut a gash in his wrist and quickly held it over Charlie's mouth. Charlie coughed once the blood hit the back of his throat. Aiden gently wrapped his left arm around Megan's shoulder. They watched Charlie's frozen body. The faint bickering of missing candy traveled from the living room to Aiden's bedroom. Once the shouting ceased, Charlie shot up and stared at them with illuminating, emerald green eyes. Megan's jaw dropped. "Are you okay, Charlie?" Aiden asked. Charlie blinked, and his eyes changed back to normal. "Yeah, that was actually pretty fun. It felt like I took a strange drug, but I got way higher than what the dealer said." Megan cocked her head as she stared at him. "What happened in there?" Charlie placed his left hand on his hip as he talked with his right. "So, I met Thanatos. Scary guy. He threw up on me and gave me some power to summon a giant bullman or something. He's got some nice muscles." Aiden locked eyes with him. "A minotaur, yeah. Then what?" "I summoned the minotaur and let him do all of the work for me," Charlie explained. "Once we beat the first trial, I felt way stronger. After that, I was out in no time. I told my bullman to fuck them up, so he did." Megan took a deep breath and stared at Charlie with narrowed brows. "How long were you down there?" Charlie stared at the wall with an unfocused gaze. Aiden and Megan leaned in as they stared at him. "That disgusting eyeball said a week and a half," Charlie replied. Aiden's jaw dropped. "Dear God." Megan tightly held her stomach on her way out of the room. "I'll be back. I'm gonna vomit." Aiden stared at him with knitted brows. "Look what you did, Charles." Charlie raised his hands, bending the wrists in opposite directions. "What did I do?" "Nothing," Aiden replied. "You did very well. I'm proud of you." Charlie looked down at his feet and back at Aiden. "During all of that, I met a man who helped me a lot while I was down there. He looked like an undercover cop and said the two of you know each other very well." Aiden's eyes broadened. "Did he show you his badge?" Charlie nodded. "Yeah, but it was too fast to catch his name." "Fuck," Aiden muttered. Megan returned to the room and leaned toward Aiden's ear. I can't believe it, she whispered. Aiden glanced at her and nodded. A fucking week and a half. 6 entered the bedroom. Aiden, come downstairs. We need to speak for a moment. He turned to his friends with raised brows. On his way down, he saw all of the keepers standing next to each other, watching him. What's all of this? Aiden asked. 7 glared at him with bulging eyes. What the fuck is going on upstairs? Aiden gritted his teeth as he glared back. I'm saving my fucking friends. What the fuck do you think I'm doing? 6 stood next to 7 and gently patted his chest with the back of his hand. 7 took a deep breath through his nostrils. He collected himself and ate a piece of candy. Hey Aiden, relax and have a smoke. The color of Aiden's eyes turned into a flurry of red and yellow. 7 looked at the ceiling and guffawed. 6 shook his head as he turned to 7. Have you made your point, Ira? Can I continue now? Do you feel like you've won yet? 7 flicked a cigarette at Aiden as he nodded. Good, 6 said as he folded his hands behind his back. Aiden, Nephilim agents are onto you. Aiden squinted his eyes. What? Why? 7 stepped forward as he glared at Aiden once again. You've morphed in public and made scenes wherever you wanted. You fucking donut. The other keepers stared at Aiden. 7 glared at him with gritted teeth. We have a very powerful demon in Japan who goes by the name of Oda, 6 explained. He'll be taking you under his wing. What does that mean? Aiden asked. You're going to Japan, you little shit. 7 shouted. Maybe you'll stop being so fucking impulsive. Aiden glared back at 7 with flared nostrils. That's rich, coming from the most juvenile keeper out of all of you. Hey, you need to relax, kiddo, 7 replied as he clicked a cigarette at his face. Have a smoke. This one is on me. The fire in Aiden's eyes returned as he clenched his jaw. The veins in 6's neck and temple looked like they were going to pop. Through his rage, he morphed his head into a terrifying serpent with 4 glowing yellow eyes. Enough. Each of them took a deep breath and straightened their posture. 6 morphed his head back into a human. You're going to Japan for a while, boy. You need to be under the radar. Staying here is not a good idea for any of us. Aiden looked at the ground and pondered. Can my friends come with me? We're forcing them to go along with you, 6 replied. Aiden returned to his room. All right, have it your way. The keepers remained in the living room and spoke privately. A few days later, Aiden and his friends gathered their belongings and took a flight to Osaka, Japan. Detective Snow was seated a few rows over, carefully watching them as he took notes. Charlie glanced at Megan and Aiden, then stared out of the window with a broad grin. This is so cool. Thanks for taking me. Aiden watched the movie on the mini screen ahead of him. It's not like you have a choice, but I'm still happy you two are with me. Megan filed her nails. This is gonna be a real culture shock. We'll be landing at Osaka International Airport, Aiden explained. Wake me up when we land, yeah? Charlie nodded. Aiden listened to music with his headphones as he tried to sleep. Detective Snow examined them as he whispered into his voice recorder. Almost 17 hours of flying later, they landed at Osaka International Airport and hailed a cab to the Marriott Miyako Hotel. Charlie buried his face into a pamphlet. The hotel we're going to is on the higher end. They even have a concert hall. Good. I can't wait, Aiden replied. Once they arrived, the 3 of them got out of the cab and walked to the front desk of the hotel. They received their room key and went to their room. Charlie examined the room with a dimpled smile. It looks great, right? For sure, Aiden replied. You were right about this one. We need a car, Aiden, Megan said. We can't get taxis everywhere. Yeah, you're right. Six gave me a shitter of money, Aiden explained. We'll be fine with expenses. Charlie continued to read the pamphlet. There's a Nuzdo car dealership a couple of blocks away. It's not far at all. The three of them heard a single knock on the door and stared at it. Aiden carefully ambled toward the door and looked through the door viewer. He slowly turned and stared at his friends. Kill them in their sleep, the voices whispered. Do it before it's too late. They will only slow you down. Aiden shook his head and looked at them with a distant gaze. Charlie tugged on his bottom lip with his teeth. Megan raised the inside corners of her brows. It's just the housekeepers, Aiden explained. Megan and Charlie let out a sigh of relief. Aiden turned to the door and opened it. Suddenly, men wearing black suits with silicone demon masks rushed in, striking Aiden in the head with the butt of a rifle. Aiden collapsed onto the floor. Their leader walked in and shot Megan and Charlie in the neck with his tranquilizer gun. They promptly dropped to the floor. The three of them were carefully taken out of their room and placed into a black limo. The leader and his hellish henchmen surrounded them. The thick cloud of cigarette smoke made it difficult to see. Rap music blared through the speakers. The leader and his masked henchmen watched as they smoked their cigarettes. Aiden woke up and scouted his surroundings. He glowered at the leader and turned to his unconscious friends. Megan, Charlie. They were heavily drugged and unresponsive. Aiden turned to the leader, locking eyes with him. You're Oda, aren't you? Oda wore a terrifying Oni mask with combed back, raven black hair. He was the only one in the limo who wore white, well-fitted, three-piece suit. His glare pierced into Aiden's very core. Sweat beaded at the top of his head. Aiden raised the inside corners of his brows. I was told you are going to take care of my friends, and Oda and his men remained silent and smoked their cigarettes. Aiden pointed at one of the henchmen. Can I borrow his pants for a second? I need to shit in them too. No? Only Japanese. Oda shouted in Japanese. Aiden stopped smiling and nodded. From that point forward, he only spoke to Oda in Japanese. Welcome to Yamato, Gaijin, Oda said. The surrounding henchmen cackled. Aiden held his chin close to his body. Thank you, Oda. The mighty Kenshi stared at him with an icy glare. That's right, Gaijin. You treat me with the same respect you would your father. Aiden nodded as he stared at the floor. Oda slammed his fist against the limo door and locked eyes with him. You bow to me, Gaijin. His henchmen turned to each other, laughing hysterically. Listen, Boka, Oda said as he took a drag from his cigarette. My men have spotted another Gaijin who follows you. Do you know of this? Have you been paying any attention? Do you know he has a room on the same floor as you? Aiden nodded and cleared his throat. He's a law enforcer who is hell-bent on capturing me. No need for puns, Oda replied. Aiden looked at the ceiling of the limo and scratched his head. I didn't. Oda raised his hand, interrupting him. You speak only when I ask questions. Understand? Yes, Oda, Aiden replied. Good, Oda said. Listen, Gaijin, we're going to Join in Koyasan. You are going to hide there, meditate with Pagoda, maybe learn something if you are capable. Aiden turned to his unconscious friends. Oda had his driver cruise from Sakai to Kawakai Nagano. They traversed Hashimoto and stopped in Koyasan. They drove past a Shinto shrine and parked on the brick road. Oda had his henchmen carry Megan and Charlie while Aiden stared at the beautiful gate of Join. Let's go, Boka Gaijin, Oda shouted. They walked past a red fire hydrant and entered the first building on their right. Oda rented a moderate-sized room for the three of them. The sliding doors had beautiful illustrations of trees with Japanese pagoda who meditated and read scrolls. Oda knelt on the floor and placed his katana in front of him. He had his men place Megan and Charlie onto their own beds. Oda beckoned Aiden. When your friends wake up, take them to see the sights. Kneel with me. Aiden promptly knelt next to him. He did his best, but was slightly slouched over. Straighten your back. Gaijin, Oda explained. Good posture leads to a relaxed state of mind. Your homework is to meditate for 10 minutes a day, every day you're here. Aiden immediately straightened his back and looked forward. Of course, Oda. Megan woke up, struggling to keep both eyes open. She examined the room and turned to Aiden. What the fuck is going on? Aiden kept his posture as he stared at the wall ahead of him. This is who's looking after us for now. Megan wiped her eyes and turned to Charlie. What did they fucking do to Charlie? Oda chuckled. The same thing I did to you, Baka. Megan squinted her eyes at Aiden and cocked her head. How do I understand Japanese? It's one of the perks, Aiden explained. We can speak and understand nearly any language. Six told me that if we are going to rule the world, we must understand it first. What the fuck has gotten into you? Megan asked. I'm just trying to do what I'm told, he replied. Six sent us here to lay low. I don't want to make this any hotter than it needs to be. Get some sleep, Gaijin. Oda shouted as he left the room with his men. Your classes start tomorrow. Over the course of 5 months, Oda had spent many hours of the day training and teaching the three of them how to fight and Japanese philosophy. Aiden finished his cup of tea and pointed it toward the housekeeper with a warm smile. Second helping, he said in Japanese. She bowed her head, took his cup, and left the room. Oda entered, wearing a black and white kimono cardigan. I must leave and take care of some business. You have the protection of Yakuza. While you're here, you are child status. Be on your best behavior. Oda sensed Megan's glare from across the room and turned to her. Aiden, why do we trust a bunch of thugs who are named after a card game? She asked. Oda grabbed the katana in front of him and charged toward her. Aiden tried to slow time down, but it had no effect on the powerful Kenshi. He swiftly pushed himself onto his feet, racing to Megan's aid. She clenched her jaw as she grabbed her daggers, then quickly threw them as she ducked away. Oda deflected them in quick succession with his razor-sharp sword and continued his pursuit. Aiden launched toward Oda, using Snologosta to attack. Oda kicked Megan into the closet next to her and furiously threw the scabbard of his katana at Aiden, hitting him in the face. Aiden stumbled backward. Moloch stormed through the wall, grabbing Oda with both hands. The vice grip on Oda's attire triggered a mechanism that fired razor-sharp blades in all directions. They shot through Moloch's hands, shredding them to ribbons. Fragments zipped past Aiden and flew into the wall next to his head. The hulking demon wept as he watched his hands crumble to the floor. A pile of bloody meat cubes laid in front of him. Moloch frantically gathered the mound of flesh with his blood-soaked wrists. Oda surged into the air and effortlessly cut the Minotaur's head off. No! Charlie cried. Aiden and Megan stood on their feet and had Oda surrounded at every angle. The demon lord knelt as he cackled. This is fun. He took a deep breath as he closed his eyes and thrust his katana into the wooden floor before leaning against it. One of his henchmen crashed into the room, landing next to them. All 4 of their heads perked up. Oda stared at the lifeless demon. Detective Snow stormed into the room, showing his badge. Get on the floor now. His reinforcements swiftly ran in, pointing their MP5s at the group. Oda carefully stood onto his feet as he stared at Detective Snow. He glanced at the three demons before disappearing into the floor. "What the fuck, Aiden?" Megan screamed. "What now?" "Use your LVGs," Snow shouted. His special enforcement unit grabbed their goggles and searched the entirety of Ikejoin. "Clear," an agent shouted. "No signs of Oda, sir." "Shit," Snow yelled. He lowered his gun and holstered it. "Arrest the kids. We're going back home." 3 of Snow's agents moved in to arrest them, while the remaining agents aimed their weapons. Snow brought them from Ikejoin to Osaka International Airport. They boarded a private plane and took off the ground. Megan sat in the back with Charlie while Snow sat in the front with Aiden. Snow leaned toward him and cleared his throat. "I'm from the Control Bureau. I know who and what you are, Mr. Newbold." Aiden raised his right brow. "What makes you think you know me?" "I know that you're a demon," Snow explained. "I know your father was killed and who the killer is." Aiden stared at the floor by his feet, then looked at Snow. A chill shot down his spine, making his stomach turn. An agent turned to Snow. "Sir, the L-radar spotted a target." "How?" Snow asked. "We're flying over Nagoya." Suddenly, the back end of the plane tore wide open. Megan and Charlie flew out of the back, plummeting to Japan. Aiden turned to Snow and punched him in the throat, then drop-kicked the agent to his left, sending him into the shelf next to them. He ran toward the end of the plane and jumped after his friends. Snow desperately tried to follow him, but collapsed onto the plane floor. Aiden crash-landed in Tenno-Pok, inside of Arakawa City. He used his eagle-like vision and saw Megan and Charlie plummet near Senja RC Station. "Newbold," Oda shouted. Aiden turned and saw him wearing bionic Shogun armor. "Oda," he replied. "Where were you?" "I escaped to gather my men, but they were all killed," Oda explained. "Humanitas took Japan from me. My brothers are gone, and I've been robbed of my belongings." Aiden locked eyes with him. "I will help the best I can. I promise." "Thank you," Oda replied as he bowed his head. "I will resume reconnaissance around Japan and find you once I'm ready." He bowed once more and disappeared out of thin air. Aiden stared at where he stood. "Cool." He darted for his friends and found the back end of the plane, but it was empty. "Aiden," Megan shouted. He heard her voice and ran through the crowd of people surrounding the wreckage. He stopped in front of a 610 convenience store, and Megan waved to him. Charlie was stuffing his face with a chili dog. Aiden ambled toward them, keeping his head down. "Oda is in trouble," he whispered. Megan knitted her brows. "Aiden, we are the ones who are in trouble." He looked at the store entrance. "No shit, but Oda is one of us. We need to help him." "Relax, dude," Charlie replied, shoving another chili dog into his mouth. "Let me eat in peace. I've had enough stress to last me a lifetime." Aiden glared at Charlie with narrowed brows. "Shut the fuck up, Charlie. Leave them behind," the voices whispered. "Give them to the Nephilim. Your power will remain stagnant." Aiden shook his head and turned to his friends. "The cops are on our asses. We can't rent a car. They'll track us down a lot faster. We need to steal a car and hide somewhere." "Okay, but I'm hungry," Megan said. Aiden rolled his eyes. "What do you want?" "I'll pay for it." "I don't know," she replied. "What do you want?" Aiden squinted his eyes. "The fuck?" Megan ran her fingers through her hair and scratched her head. "Whatever you're in the mood for is fine with me." Aiden stared at her with a blank face. I'm not even hungry. You said you wanted something. Yeah, but do you want to share something? She asked. Aiden let out a pronounced sigh. Sure, yeah, I'll share something with you. What do you want to eat? I don't know, she replied. What do you want? Please. Aiden shouted. Pick something. There's an Napoli place a few blocks away, Charlie said. Aiden's eyes broadened. Great, we're going there. I'm not in the mood for that though, Megan replied. Listen, Aiden said, we're going. They traversed the streets of Japan until they found the restaurant and grabbed a table. Look, a butter chicken curry set, Aiden said. 1,200 yen. Sounds good to me. They finished eating their food and walked outside. Charlie held his stomach as he turned to them. That food isn't sitting very well with me. They stopped walking and threw up on the public sidewalk. Aiden wiped his face. I don't think I'm ready for human food yet. We need to get the fuck out of here, Charlie said. Fuck. I feel gross, Megan replied. They checked both ends of the street, and no one saw them. They wiped their faces and ran a few blocks away. The group continued down the 461 on Boca-Tadori Avenue. They stopped and stood in front of a garage. That's the spot, Aiden said. A car drove up and stopped at the red light. The pretty woman who drove the car waved at Aiden. Megan stormed toward her with clenched fists. Get the fuck out of the car, bitch. The woman screamed as Megan grabbed her by the hair and threw her into the middle of the intersection. Get in. Charlie gaped at Megan as they hopped into the car. She drove through the intersection and over the woman screaming in fear. Blood and brain matter coated the road. Aiden popped his head out of the window and looked at the body. Holy shit, Megan. She focused on the road with a demented grin. She's fine. Charlie stuffed his face into his pamphlet. Now that we've had a piece of the nation's kitchen, let's lay low and see some stuff. Megan looked through the rearview mirror and nodded. Where to? Charlie looked back. How about we start with America Mura? They drove through Osaka while Charlie took pictures. Look, he cheered. They actually made a replica of the Statue of Liberty. Huh. Megan and Aiden turned their heads and smiled. Once they parked the car, the group ambled to a convenience store and bought lemon strong zeros. Aiden pointed at a retro video game bar. Okay, you guys have had your fun. Let's go there. The three of them walked inside, ordered a round of beer, then played games, enjoying each other's company for hours. I kicked your ass, Aiden. Megan shouted. Fuck you, I let you win. Aiden replied. Charlie pointed across the street. Hey guys, let's get some takoyaki. There's a stand over there. They ordered deep-fried octopus balls and stuffed their faces. Wait for it, Charlie said. Filled with anxiety, the three of them watched each other. Minutes had passed before they questioned themselves. Why hasn't our stomachs turned inside out? Megan asked. Maybe takoyaki to us is like candy to seven, Aiden replied. Let's go to a karaoke bar. It's all you can drink, Charlie shouted. They traversed the city and eventually found a music bar. They ordered drinks and sang to each other for hours. Once they were finished, they made their way toward the Omon Tokyo Hotel. Aiden handed the clerk double the amount of yen to get a room without a credit card or identification. He and Megan walked to their room. Charlie went to his with a random guy he met from the bar. Aiden knelt in front of the television, meditating with perfect posture. Megan laid on the bed completely naked as she watched him. What are you doing? Aiden replied. He remained perfectly still and completely silent. Megan pushed her head off her hand as she raised an eyebrow. Charlie read a magazine while the guy he met gave him a foot massage. Oda appeared next to Aiden on the balcony. and tapped the window with his index finger. I then tilted and fell on the floor. Fuck. Oda walked through the window like a ghost. Charlie barged into their room once he heard the commotion. Our first stop is Sapporo, Oda explained. Nephilim agents have killed my guards and taken my factory. That was my main source of income from the Hokkaido region. I then stood on his feet and turned to him with knitted brows. Let's take it back. I'll help you. Thank you, Oda said. Rest for the night. We'll travel there tomorrow morning. He bowed and disappeared out of thin air. Megan looked at Aiden with squinted eyes. Are you really going to help him, Aiden? Why shouldn't I? He replied. He's helped us so much. What do you suggest we do without him? He kicked the shit out of us, Aiden, Charlie said. Don't you think that was part of training? Aiden replied as he packed his belongings. He needs help, so I'm going to help him. I don't care if you come or not. The next morning, they drove to Haneda Airport and met up with Oda. They entered his private jet and took off on their journey to Sapporo. Does this mean we'll get free beer for life? Charlie asked. What a deal that would be, Megan replied. An hour and a half later, they landed in New Kitos Airport and exited the plane. We have a drive ahead of us, Oda said on his way to the parked car. Come with me. He reached around the front left tire and grabbed the car key. Then the group drove out of Kitos, traversed Eniwa, and finally stopped in Sapporo. They pulled into the factory parking lot and parked far enough for reconnaissance. I will continue inside, alone, Oda explained. It wouldn't make sense for them to be outside at all. I'll return after scouting. Aiden nodded. Oda got out of the car and ran toward the factory. He used his high-caliber athletic training to scale the factory and creep inside using an open window. Why does Oda need us? Megan asked. Isn't he as powerful as Seven or something? He doesn't have anyone else, remember? Aiden explained. He isn't a keeper either. He can't just snap his fingers and win his fights. Megan let out a pronounced sigh. What if we were in the same situation at home? Aiden asked. What if we owned the world and it was just taken away? Wouldn't you want someone to help? Megan scowled as she stared at the factory. Charlie pinched his lips and looked through the Reddit app on his phone. Oh my goodness, why do idiots post their lives on the internet? People are so embarrassing. Aiden looked over his shoulder. Why are you on social media then? Charlie stared at him with a blank face. Touché. Aiden and Megan lost track of time, waiting for Oda. How long is he going to be? She yelled. Dude, relax, Charlie replied. Aiden hopped out of the car. No, she's right. He's been in there for ages. He ran toward the factory and quickly scaled it, then used the window to look inside. Oda was beaten to a bloody pulp and was hung by his wrists. Armed Nephilim agents guarded the bottom floor. Aiden crept into the factory and disappeared. With knitted brows, Megan leaned forward. Are you fucking serious? Where the fuck is he going? She looked over her shoulder. I'm going inside, Charlie. Detective Snow had his hand cannon aimed at Charlie's face. Charlie surrendered himself with his hands in the air. I think we should go with him, Megan. Megan dotted a glance between the pair and shook her head. Snow escorted them to the factory with his gun aimed at their backs. His enforcement squad followed behind him. Megan, Charlie, and Snow ambled inside and were stunned at what they saw. Nephilim soldiers screamed in terror as their faces were melted down to the bone. They suddenly turned to Snow and stared at him in unison. Their melted eyes and charred faces had him speechless. I'll burn the faces off of the pious. Aiden shouted. It starts with you, Snow. Snow walked farther into the factory and examined his surroundings. Show yourself, Newbold. Asriel will give you proper guidance. He promptly grabbed his two-way radio and whispered into it, stay alert. Look at every corner. Let go of my fucking friends. Iden screamed. Snow grabbed Megan by the hair and dragged her to the center of the room. Megan cried out in pain. Let go of me, she shouted. Iden slammed onto the floor in front of them. His scarlet-red demonic exterior cracked the cement floor. He turned to Snow with a fiery glare. You're one of Azrael's. Finally, he cheered. You can answer for him. Listen to me, Newbold. Snow explained. Asriel had nothing to do with it. Demon soldiers killed my brothers and took their weapons. We were set up by Den. Liar. Iden screamed. His voice echoed throughout the factory, shattering its windows. I can tell you more, Snow replied. Let me take you home. Let Asriel tell you the truth. Open your mind. You assholes killed my father. Iden screamed. You're trying to take the rest of my family. Fuck you, Snow. Charlie flashed his emerald green eyes and grabbed Iden's attention. He used his hands to coordinate an attack. Megan surged into the air with a large scarlet-red cloud emanating off her body. Before landing, she threw her knives, cutting Snow several times. Snow stepped back, covering his bleeding wounds. Iden glared at Snow's enforcement unit and corrupted their minds with his hypnotic power. They dropped to their hands and knees as they screamed in terror, immediately vomiting blood onto the cement floor. With all of the wrath in his soul, Iden burned their faces off. All of the characteristics that defined them as Nephilim had melted away. Snow went galumphing out of the factory in a blind panic. Iden reached his right arm out, waving his hand over the fallen angels. You are now children of wrath. The mutilated agents turned to him and saluted in unison. Yes, Overlord. Iden, Megan, and Charlie each grinned from ear to ear as they marveled at their new army. Iden shed his demonic skin, making him human once more. I rescued Oda. They weakened him with some type of holy bullet. I'll search the property, Megan said as she raced to the exit. Snow might have more men in the area. I'll hold the place down and look after Oda, Charlie said. Okay, good, we have a plan, Iden replied. Oda examined one of the agents with a poke to its face. This is a nice trick. Iden turned to him. They're yours, Oda. Oda's face lit up behind his mask. Oh, ha ha ha, cover those faces at once. Yes, sir, they replied, and ran out of the factory. Oda stood next to Iden and bowed to him with an unseen grin. Thank you for helping me take back my factory. Nvidia was serious about you, Mephistopheles. Who's Mephistopheles? Charlie asked. Oda cackled as he pointed at Iden, the boy who traded his soul for unimaginable power. I didn't have a choice, Iden explained. Seven found me, and the next thing I knew, I turned into this monstrosity. He morphed into a hulking, scarlet-skinned demon with red and yellow eyes. Oh, you didn't choose this path, Mephistopheles. Oda replied as he crossed his arms. Perhaps it was destiny who chose you. Perhaps some sort of grand power had pushed you toward your trials. Charlie and Iden looked at each other and pondered. Megan walked inside in her human form. You should take the night off, Oda said with a gentle disposition. Go enjoy the nightlife with your wife. Iden looked at Megan's rosy face. We're not married. With the way you look at each other, you might as well be, Oda replied. Iden and Megan gazed into the eyes of each other. I must scout the rest of Japan in search of any Nephilim who may linger. Oder explained. All of the best, Mephistopheles. Moments later, he disappeared out of thin air. Charlie smirked as he pointed to Ode's last known location. He's cool. Megan crossed her arms and looked at the floor. He's not so bad, I guess. Let's go out tonight, Aiden said. I have a place in mind. I'm dying for a good drink, Charlie said emphatically. Megan turned to him with a dimpled smile. Let's go get you one. The group drove to Rando Residential Hotel and rented a room with cash. They freshened up and made their way to a jazz club named Bossa. Aiden parked the car around the corner and they hopped out. Megan pointed at a restaurant window. What the fuck is that? It says Nose Burger, Charlie replied. They look really good. Aiden marveled at the giant posters of burgers, and his mouth salivated. Charlie gaped at another poster. That tabikiri cheeseburger looks delicious. When we're done with Bossa, I'm getting the Nose Burger, Aiden said. The beef sauce looks tasty. Megan turned to him with a closed-lipped smile. The teriyaki burger looks amazing. They walked into the club and were welcomed by happy patrons and warm jazz music. Jazz music played out of the club speakers. They picked a table and sat down. A waitress took their order and returned with 3 pints of beer. They each took a sip from their glasses and waited. Their silence was deafening. No vomit, Megan whispered. Aiden and Charlie's faces lit up. No vomit. They cheered. They drank beer and listened to music for the rest of the night. They will take you for granted, the voices whispered. Kill them while you can. Aiden ignored their warnings and focused on his friends. Charlie saw a man who stared back at him. If you'll excuse me, I have a serpent to tame. Aiden let out suppressed laughter and smirked at Megan. Good luck, man. Charlie got out of his seat and ambled to the man's table. Aiden and Megan gazed at each other in adoration. Thank you for always being with me. I appreciate you, Aiden said. You know I'd do anything for you, she replied. Aiden reached for her hand, gently caressing it, then raised the inside corners of his brows. I don't always say it or show it, but I like you a lot. Megan smirked and buried her lips in her mouth. You don't have to say it. I know you do. I like you a lot too. He looked at her with a warm smile. My adoration for you is like diarrhea. I just can't keep it in. Megan quickly covered her mouth as she laughed. They both smiled and enjoyed the jazz music. Do you want to know what else I like a lot? She asked. Bright stars in a pink and purple galaxy. It's so pretty. Aiden reached behind his neck and undid the lock on Edward's necklace. He stared at it before handing it to her. Take this. I want you to have it. Megan held the necklace in her hand and opened the pendant. That's a beautiful picture of your parents, she said, wiping her watery eyes. They checked Charlie's table and noticed he was missing. Aiden, where is he? Megan asked. Aiden frantically scouted the club. I don't know. I didn't see him leave. Maybe he's taking a piss. While seated, they aimlessly checked each table. Charlie approached them with a pep in his step. Aiden and Megan let out a sigh of relief. Oh, you just went to take a leak, Aiden said. Nah man, Charlie replied. I got laid in the bathroom. I can check Asian off my list. Oh my god. Spill the fucking tea, girl, Megan said. Charlie turned to her with a lopsided grin. I'll tell you later. Aiden nodded, glancing at them. Thanks, I appreciate it. Hours of drinking later, they left the jazz club and walked to Nose Burger for food. I wash right. Aiden drunkenly shouted. Fish burger-ish fucking good. They finished their burgers and sat on the curb. Aiden felt a rumble in his stomach and placed his hand on it, then leaned forward with his head between his knees. Oh no. Megan slowly rubbed his back. Aiden grabbed his paper takeout bag and violently threw up a chunky, vile discharge into it. He felt the weight of excreted waste and dropped it onto the ground. Moments later, Megan and Charlie felt a disturbance in their stomachs and threw up into their takeout bags. I hate that it's a gamble with this whole food thing, Aiden said as he stared at his feet. I just want to love food again. They couldn't find a garbage bin, so they tossed them into the middle of the street and acted as if nothing happened. Megan hailed a taxi, and they went back to their hotel. Aiden and Megan went to their bedroom. Charlie went to his. We've bumped into an adult scene. Thanks YouTube. Aiden later woke up to the faint sound of laughter and stared at the ceiling. The Banshee Queen stared at him with a demented glare. She pleasured herself at the sight of Aiden's naked body, moaning in ecstasy. Aiden grimaced and looked away. When she finished, the Banshee rolled her snow-white eyes from the back of her head and glared at him once more. He stared at her until she vanished through the ceiling, with her laughter echoing in the distance. He sat up on the edge of his bed and took a deep breath, then looked at Megan and grabbed his phone. Why is she spying on me? He left the hotel and listened to music as he walked the streets of Sapporo. Aiden eventually found himself inside of Nakajima Park and circled the trail. Mephistopheles. Oda shouted. His head perked up. Oda, he asked, what's wrong? I've been tracking the Nephilim, he explained. They aren't pleased with the outcome of the factory. You and your friends must tread carefully. Aiden knitted his brows as he clenched his jaw. They can't do a thing about it. I understand your apprehension, but I'll stand my ground. My friends and I are here for you. The Nephilim are crafty. Oda chuckled. Say that now, Mephistopheles. The desire to sate your appetite of Nephilim blood is endearing. Aiden's eyes broadened. I've been itching to get my hands on the Nephilim who have killed my father. Contact me when they find you. Megan approached them, short of breath, and soaked in a viscous golden goo. Aiden, she shouted. Charlie is missing. They stormed the hotel and took him. Aiden turned to her with knitted brows. Fuck, how did you find me? Megan glanced at them and looked at the night sky. I don't know. It felt like you were here, so I started running. You're the same blood, Oda explained. You can track each other that way. I can travel to places I've been to with my mind, but I have no clue how to track down Charlie. Aiden replied. I can't do what she can. What I did was think about what you look like, what you smell like, and what you mean to me, she explained. Let me do that with Charlie. Bear with me, Aiden said as he closed his eyes. He saw nothing but darkness. Suddenly, millions of images flashed through his mind. He saw a mysterious hand placed on Charlie's mouth while he slept. He looked through Charlie's eyes as he was taken from the hotel to a mysterious car that drove him to New Kitos Airport. A kaleidoscope-like tunnel clouded Aiden's vision until it imploded into a void of darkness. He opened his eyes and was brought back to reality. He's at the airport. Oda nodded and turned in that direction. Quick, Mephistopheles, we must intercept your friend before they leave, he said, and vanished out of thin air. Megan looked at Aiden with knitted brows. Fuck, what now? He turned to her, giving his right arm. Hold on to me. She stood next to him and wrapped her arms around him. He focused his mind on the airport, and they promptly teleported to a secluded area with a small cloud of lilac smoke. Oda appeared next to them and crouched as he scouted the area. Mephistopheles, I've scouted the airport, he explained. Snow has his men in almost every corner. We need to be careful, or not only will Nephilim know about our presence, but humans will too. We cannot let humans know anything of our existence, let alone our visit here. Iden nodded. Oda checked the gadgets on his wrist and turned to them. Be careful, he said, and vanished out of thin air. The alarm system in the airport echoed throughout the property. Megan turned to Iden. What do we do now? He took a deep breath and scouted the area using his eagle-like vision. Let's wait for the alarms to turn off. We'll go in when they are not on high alert. He saw some of Snow's men crash through the windows and fall on the pavement. Men and women inside of the airport screamed in terror. Moloch burst through the walls and destroyed the back end of the airport. The alarm grew much louder once it echoed out of the gap in the wall. Moloch let out a mighty roar and launched from one Nephilim to the next, tearing them limb from limb. Iden and Megan carefully crept toward the property. They had managed to stealth their way through the hole in the wall, undetected. The mighty Minotaur sat next to a mound of Nephilim cadavers, grabbing each corpse and popping their heads off with a flick on his thumb. He squeezed the body and drank their innards like a tube of toothpaste. He occasionally beat his chest like a gorilla and looked at his delicious food with an animated disposition. Ha ha ha, your brothers and sisters taste good, Nephilim scum. If Moloch is out, Charlie must have had the time to summon him, Iden explained. He's got to be okay. Megan nodded. Then they sneaked into a debaucher's store and watched as the golden goo-soaked Minotaur stuff his face. Whoa, who the fuck is that? Megan asked. A powerful Nephilim approached Moloch with his company of agents. He and his men stared at the mighty Minotaur. The leader's thick armor was platinum with golden trim. He wore massive plated gloves for weapons. Pendulous cords connected into the back of his helmet, draping to the floor. His helmet masked the entirety of his head. The leader pointed at the towering beast with his giant gauntlet. Moloch, he shouted. The hulking Minotaur raised a brow and cocked his head. We have your master. The leader shouted. Where is Iden, you bold? Moloch cackled. Ha ha ha, I will gnaw on your bones, Ramiel, you and all of your lobotomized meerkats. Iden's eyes broadened. The guardian of kindness, he whispered. Megan turned to him. What kind of fucking title is that? Tell me where he is, demon. Ramiel shouted. The cords in the back of his helmet rose above his head as they aimed at the hulking beast. The tips slowly opened, making a loud audible squeal. Moloch glared at him. What do you plan to accomplish, fool? Ramiel displayed his calm demeanor. I plan on getting an answer. Ha ha ha. Moloch cackled as he quickly stood onto his feet and surged into the air. He slammed onto Ramiel's agents with his mighty fists, then grabbed one of their legs and violently threw their body at the powerful guardian. A brilliant beam of golden light fired out of the cords in Ramiel's helmet, instantly disintegrating the Nephilim corpse. I know he's here, Moloch, he shouted. Give him up. Moloch panted through his nostrils and charged toward him, shoving and throwing everything in his path. Ramiel clenched his iron fist and readied himself. The massive demon swiped at Ramiel with his massive claws as he roared at the top of his lungs. Ramiel effortlessly jumped into the air and punched Moloch in the face. A pocket of air formed where the hit landed and instantly exploded. Moloch dropped to the floor with his jaw torn off, showing no signs of life. Jet black ichor poured out of his mouth and pulled onto the floor. Megan looked at Iden. I'm not offended by his title anymore. Ramiel quickly collected himself and scouted the room. I know you're here, Iden. Your presence is potent. Iden hid behind a counter as he knelt on the floor, then turned to Megan and pulled her close. Ramiel ambled around the room in search of him. "We own the police, Aiden. They are not coming. We can simply write this off. Listen to what Snow said and come with me." Aiden looked at Megan, holding his index finger over his mouth. "We have Charlie." Ramiel shouted, "Listen to me. Get some kind of vehicle," Aiden whispered. "We need to get the fuck out of here. I'll distract him." He jumped over the counter and ambled toward Ramiel. Megan pushed herself up and ran toward the gap in the wall as quickly as she could. Ramiel turned to Aiden and aimed at him with the cords in his helmet. Aiden looked over his shoulder and clutched the hilt of his sword. Ramiel lowered the cords and straightened his posture. "All we want is to bring you home and talk." "Talk about what?" Aiden asked. "That your people didn't kill my father." "That's exactly what I would like to talk about," Ramiel explained. "Your keepers are whopping your mind. It's too much for one person." "Bullshit," Aiden shouted as he morphed into a ferocious demon. "I survived my trials. I am more than human." "Heavens," Ramiel whispered as he froze. "Snow hasn't informed me of this. Does Yggdrasil know you're a demon?" Aiden squinted his eyes. "Why should he have to know anything?" "You're a simple human," Ramiel explained as he examined Aiden. "You were supposed to give us your blood, not the other way around. What have they done to you?" "I'm so sorry." Aiden stared at the ground as he pondered. Clearly, Snow's approach didn't work. Ramiel said, reaching his hand out. "Please, Aiden, come home with me, so we can talk with Azrael." "He's lying," the voices whispered. "They will imprison you. Not to be trusted." Aiden swatted his hand away. "Stop trying to manipulate me. You're blackmailing me for my friend." Ramiel lowered his hand and stepped back. "You will have to come with us, or you will not see your friend again." Aiden unsathed Snolagosta and unholstered his gun. The cords in Ramiel's helmet squealed as they opened. Aiden flipped backward and launched toward Ramiel with extreme speed. He managed to sever all of the cords. Dribbles of viscous golden goo leaked out of the hollowed cords. Ramiel promptly turned to him. "Your speed is incredible. At first, I thought your involvement was trivial, but from what I've seen, I know you can bring the Guardian's equilibrium. How are you so strong?" Aiden gave him a razor-sharp glare. "I've been trying to figure that out myself." "They've seriously sent humans through trials?" Ramiel asked. "Yes," he replied. "I've sent my friends there as well." Ramiel froze as he stared at him. Aiden took a deep breath as he stared back. "Forget about bringing you to Azrael," Ramiel said. "I'm taking you to Yggdrasil. He must hear of this." Aiden pointed Snolagosta at him. "Fuck that. I'm going to find Charlie on my own." Megan flew into the airport on a motorcycle and parked next to Aiden. He fired his gun at Ramiel as he hopped onto the back seat of the motorcycle. Ramiel reached his hand out. "No." Megan went full throttle toward the exit. EDM music blared out of the bike stereo system. She drove out of the airport and raced down the freeway. Ramiel quickly caught up with them on his massive motorcycle. He laid on his stomach, using his helmet to navigate it. His motorcycle was 4x the size of theirs. "Floyd!" Aiden shouted. "He's right behind us." Megan pushed the motorcycle as far as she could, dodging and swerving between any car in front of her. Aiden looked over his shoulder and fired his gun at the passing cars. The drivers slammed on their brakes in front of Ramiel. The Guardian pressed a button on his handlebars and leaped over the parked cars. Megan drove down Japan National Route 36, and made her way toward Tamarkomai. Iden fired his gun at Ramiel, but the mighty guardian showed no signs of ceasing his pursuit. The bike deflected each and every bullet. Megan turned into oncoming traffic and forced each car to stop in the middle of the road. Iden reached for Snolagosta and hurled his mighty blade toward Ramiel's bike. The holy guardian jumped off his motorcycle and over the sword. Once he landed on the bike, Ramiel swerved out of the way before Snolagosta returned to Iden's hand. He looked ahead, and they had disappeared into the city of Tamarkomai. Ramiel slammed on the brakes and stared at the bustling city. He pulled a U-turn and drove back to the airport. Megan circled the city and drove down National Route 36 into Shiroi. They went to Piriklola Hotel and stayed the night. After drinking alcohol from the bar, Iden and Megan laid naked in bed and stared at the ceiling. "Poor Charlie," Megan said as she caressed his chest with her fingertips. "I wonder what they are doing to him." "We'll save him, I promise," Iden replied. "He has Moloch to protect him." "Yay, but Moloch left him behind at the airport," she said. "From the looks of it, Charlie can summon him at will," Iden explained. "If he needs Moloch's protection, he has it. Let's just hope a guardian doesn't find him." Ramiel knocked Moloch clean on his ass. I don't want to imagine what Ramiel would do if he got his hands on Charlie. They locked fingers and placed their hands on his chest. "Ramiel said the keepers were never supposed to give me their blood," he said. "What does that mean for me? What does it mean for you? Or Charlie? You were supposed to let me die," Megan explained. "I already know. I wasn't meant to go through that mess. But I've gained something from this. I feel like I can choose my own path. It's because of you that I choose my own future. In my opinion, I think that's what Seven wanted for you." I then stared at the ceiling. "I mean, when you word it like that, I guess it makes sense." Oda opened the balcony door as he filed through gadgets on his wrist. "Mephistopheles, I might have word on the whereabouts of Charlie Scott." I then shot out of bed and ambled toward him. "Where?" "My men have told me they have spotted him in Saitama, near Tokyo," Oda explained. "We'll head there immediately," I then replied. "Going now wouldn't be a good move," Oda explained. "Ramiel is fixated on capturing you." "Do you have a plane at the airport?" I then asked. Oda glanced at the wall and looked at him. "My helicopter is there." I then started getting dressed. "Good, let's go, Megan. There will be a militia of Nephilim waiting for you," Oda explained. "I will help once you arrive." Moments later, he vanished out of thin air. Iden and Megan finished getting ready and teleported to Nukitos Airport. Once they arrived, Oda appeared next to them. He was fully dressed in his bionic platinum black Shogun armor. He looked at them with his onyx black eyes. "My men are nearby, Mephistopheles. They will attack once I give my signal." I then nodded and turned to Megan. They read each other's thoughts as they listened to music. Minutes later, they morphed into bloodthirsty demons and used their nocturnal vision to storm the airport in the black of night. Oda stayed behind and gathered his men. Iden and Megan tag-teamed the Nephilim agents who guarded and patrolled the gap in the building. She attacked their ankles while he slashed their throats. Oda approached them with his army of fierce shinobi. Ramiel ambled out of the hole in the building with a platoon of Nephilim agents. They carried assault rifles with a standard katana. Oda turned to his men and raised his right hand. "We are outnumbered. If we die, it will be glorious." His shinobi warriors let out a vigorous battle cry. Iden and Megan readied their weapons and dotted for Ramiel. The benevolent guardian saw them coming and went into his fighting stance. His agents focused on Oda and his Shinobi. The two demons took turns attacking Ramiel with their extreme speed. Megan used her razor-sharp knives to pierce through his thick armor while Aiden kicked him in the face with all of the power he could muster. Ramiel flew into the airport lobby without the acknowledgement of his men. Oda and his Shinobi continued the fight outside while Aiden and Megan kept Ramiel busy inside. The two demons waited for him to stand as he carefully pushed himself onto his feet. Megan dove for his feet as she firmly grasped her jagged daggers. Ramiel saw her coming and kicked her in the stomach. She flew into a store across the room. Aiden grabbed Snolagosta and used his extreme speed to attack him. Ramiel saw his sword and ducked underneath it in the nick of time. He cranked his arm back and punched Aiden in the chest with great force. A pocket of air exploded, sending Aiden into the wall next to them. His velocity molded the wall with an imprint of his body. The mighty guardian sprinted and drove his knee into Aiden's stomach. Chunks of debris fell out of the wall, crumbling into a pile of rubble. Ramiel landed on his feet. Aiden slid off the wall and landed on his face. Megan threw a fistful of knives, puncturing Ramiel's back. A bright golden light leaked out of each wound, swallowing the knives entirely. Megan charged at Ramiel as swiftly as she could. Ramiel aimed at her with the cords in his helmet. Multiple beams of light immediately fired in her direction. She flipped backward and twirled in the air, evading the terrifying lasers. With his unparalleled speed, Aiden used Snolagosta to sever the cords in Ramiel's helmet. Golden viscous goo sprayed onto the wall behind him. Megan cranked her arm back and readied herself. Ramiel dashed toward Megan, kneeing her in the stomach with all of his might. She flew a few feet backward and vomited onto the floor by her feet. Aiden ran toward Ramiel and stabbed him in the back with his fearsome blade, then ripped the sword out of his body and watched the blue and gold pearlescent blood gush out of his open wound. Breathing heavily, the guardian covered his wound with the back of his hand as he fell onto one knee. "You win, demon. I relinquish my place in this fight." Aiden leaned his boot onto Ramiel and shoved him on the floor. He took a deep breath as he glared into Ramiel's eyes. "You're going to die here," he whispered. Oda ran into the room, shouting, "We've defeated the Nephilim outside. Mephistopheles, my men have spotted Snow and his reinforcements. We need to take off the ground now." Aiden lifted the hilt of his blade before he thrust his sword into Ramiel's chest. Megan tugged on his arm, and they ran toward the helicopter. They quickly hopped inside and flew out of the airport. As they hovered over the building, Aiden and Megan saw Snow leading his brigade of Nephilim agents inside. They watched as the massive horde of angels swarmed the area. "That looks like a lot of fun," Megan said. "I agree," Aiden replied. "I wanted to finish him off before we left." A Lylin agent sat across from them, breathing heavily. "You two are crazy, sir." Aiden sneered at the agent and looked away. "Sorry, sir. It will not happen again, sir," the agent replied. Megan grabbed his collar and pulled him closer. "You do not get to speak to us like that, you fucking rodent. What the fuck is wrong with you?" The agent tried controlling his quivering lip and began to fidget as he looked outside of the window. "What's wrong with you?" Megan asked. I pissed myself," the agent replied. "Right? Good," she said, and leaned into her chair once she let him go. "Are you okay?" The agent patted himself down and collected himself. "Yeah, I'm fine." "Good. Fuck off," she said as she crossed her arms. The agent straightened his posture and refused to look at anything but through the window. Aiden smacked as he looked over the city of Sapporo. They flew south over Mutsu Bay on their way to Saitama. "Mephistopheles, we will soon land in Ogano," Oda explained. We will move the rest of the way on land to avoid being detected. Aiden nodded. Of course, Oda, Megan replied. Oda went through his battle plans with his agents while Aiden and Megan rested in their seats. Once they landed, the two demons stepped out of the helicopter and scouted the area. He has been here, the voices whispered. You must hurry. The hair on Aiden's neck stood up as he turned to Megan. Charlie's close. The two of them ran ahead, searching through the dense forest. In the time span of 30 seconds, they ran from Suwanoya Sho to Anigari shrine named Okamiya. They suddenly heard the sound of a woman screaming. What the fuck? Aiden asked. All the way out here. Let's see what it is, Megan said as she approached the source. It's over there. The woman's screams grew louder the closer they came. They crept through a bush and saw Seven leaning against a tree as he held a decapitated demon head by the hair. The head glared at Aiden with its protuberant eyes and mimicked the voice of a horrified woman. Megan grimaced as she stared at the head, unable to look away. That shit will haunt me in my dreams forever. With a grin on his face, Seven ate a piece of candy. I'm happy you two fuckwits decided to show. Hey, kiddo. Aiden glowered at him. What the fuck do you want, Seven? We're trying to find Charlie. Hey, no hi Seven, I missed you. He asked as he flicked a cigarette at Aiden. Take the edge off, kiddo. Why don't you have a smoke? It's on me. Fucking asshole, Aiden muttered. Seven cackled as he threw the screaming head into the bushes. Aiden glared at Seven with knitted brows. Why are you here, Seven? Why was Ramil so disturbed when I told him about us being demons? He wanted to take us to Yggdrasil. You infallibly lie. So be honest for once. Seven shook the bottom of his brown paper bag. You two have made some friends. Those friends ratted on you. Yggdrasil isn't happy with not only the three of you, but with the keepers and myself. Six was right. Turning you into one of us has finally turned into a heaping pile of burning shit. Yggdrasil is riding my ass so hard. You have no idea. Aiden stared at him with a blank face. He told me things, Seven. He said my father's death was staged. Seven ate another piece of candy. You know whatever they tell you is bullshit, right? Everyone knows you're the key. At the end of the day, we got to you first. They are pissed, so they are doing anything to take you from us. They are making this their fucking high school drama. It's really that simple. I don't know, Aiden replied. He sounded pretty convincing. It's bullshit, kiddo. He's lying to your face. Anyway, I wanted to tell you about Yggdrasil. Word on a meeting is in the works. I'll be back to get you soon. Oh yeah, your snowflake is definitely in Saitama. Moments later, Seven vanished. Aiden and Megan looked at each other, then traversed the vast forest. They picked up a scent that led them to Usagir. Moloch's corpse and a mound of Nephilim cadavers laid on the ground, next to a power line at the top of a hill. We have to be close, Megan said. Aiden knelt next to Moloch and examined the scene. They followed Charlie's scent and traveled through Chikibu toward the village of Nagsua. The two demons saw a village in ruin. Houses were reduced to rubble. A Nephilim agent stood on his hands and knees. One of Moloch's nails was lodged into his left shoulder. As the agent turned to them, he projectile vomited jet black ooze and convulsed in agonizing pain. Soon after, his body absorbed Moloch's talon, and his wound healed. The reborn Lylin stood onto his feet and looked at Aiden as he pointed toward the house on a hill. He's waiting for you, sir, the agent said, and walked along the dirt path. The two demons glanced at each other and ambled to the house. Moloch sat in front of it while he feasted on Nephilim corpses. Preoccupied with his delicious repast, Megan and Iden walked past him and stepped into the mysterious house. Once they entered, the refreshing aroma of Sencha Carragane punched them in the face. The scent lingered in the living room and traveled into the kitchen. "Holy shit, it's you!" Iden shouted. Charlie sat in a chair with one leg hanging over the other while he sipped his tea. "Oh hey!" Megan ran to him with open arms. Charlie placed his cup on the table next to him and gave her a hug. "Hey, honey, grab a seat you two. It's fucking tea time." He sat back down and continued sipping his tea. Iden and Megan sat down and turned to him. "So, what happened?" Iden asked. "Where were you?" Charlie's eyes lit up as he pointed at him with his index and middle finger. "When you were gone, Megan and I tried our best to fight off Snow and his agents. They knocked me out and took me all over Japan. Those motherfuckers brought me to Saga, then to Kyoto." Iden narrowed his brows and squinted his eyes. "But why?" Charlie leaned into his chair as he enjoyed his tea. "In search of Oda's properties, I assume. They figured if they take them away, Oda would ask for your help." "How did you get free?" Megan asked. "Lylin attacked us," he explained. "We crash-landed somewhere around here. Some of Snow's men mentioned something about Mility's Nvidia. Take that as you will. They were busy fighting each other, so I stepped away and hid in this village. This house looked cute, so I summoned Moloch as protection." Megan gave Charlie a tight-lipped smile. "I'm glad you decided to take a break. I fought a guardian to get to you." Charlie almost choked on his tea and leaned forward. "Wait, what bitch?" Iden leaned into his chair. "Ramiel showed up to help Snow with his manhunt. They were not happy at all about us being demons. I was never supposed to go through the trials. None of us were." Charlie's eyes broadened. "Holy shit." Iden and Megan stood onto their feet. "I have an idea," Iden said. "Let's get the fuck out of here before anything else happens." Charlie finished his tea and put the dishes in the sink. "What are you doing?" Megan asked. Charlie looked over his shoulder. "Girl, it's not my house. I'm not leaving it trashed." "Get down," Iden shouted. Moloch flew into the small home, and over the three of them, Iden perked his head up and examined the demolished house. The hulking Minotaur quickly pushed himself up and launched toward the front of the house. Hundreds of Nephilim agents pointed their guns at the four of them. Moloch looked over his shoulder. "Master, run." They turned in the opposite direction and raced across the open field. Thousands of bullets flew through the air, zipping past their heads. Before he entered the forest with Megan and Charlie, Iden looked back at Moloch. The hulking beast lay dead on the ground, riddled with bullets. The army of agents started marching toward Iden until Oda and his men intercepted them. The mighty Kensi thrived on the battlefield. The battle cry of him and his men echoed past them and traveled into the dense forest. "Grab me," Iden shouted. Charlie and Megan wrapped their arms around him. Within seconds, they were back to Koyasan. They walked to Ikejoin and spent the night there. The next morning, Iden woke up and saw Seven hang upside down from the ceiling. He stared at Iden as he ate his candy. "It's time to go back home," Seven said. "It's clearly not safe to stay here any longer. Yggdrasil is ready to speak with us. It wouldn't be smart to linger." He turned upright and dropped from the ceiling. "I'll see you soon, Seven," Iden replied. "I need to see if Oda is okay." Seven placed his hand on Iden's shoulder. "I'll just take you to him." They directly teleported to Oda in Nagsawa on the open battlefield. It was littered with malevolent, and benevolent corpses. Oda leaned against his tacky sword on one knee. His shogun armor was stained with black and golden ichor. Aiden's eyes broadened the moment he saw him. "Oda!" he shouted, racing to his aid. Oda's head perked up. He laughed once he heard Aiden's voice. "You missed all of the fun, Mephistopheles." He took a deep breath and collapsed onto the ground. His body was loaded with bullets. Aiden knelt next to him and lent his hand. "You saved our lives, Oda." Oda took his mask off and swatted Aiden's hand. "Their bullets are designed to kill us. Let me die." He grabbed his wakizashi and handed it to Aiden. "My family is gone, but you still have yours. You have a katana, but no wakizashi. Take mine and protect your family." Aiden grabbed the sword and attached its scabbard to Snologosta's. Seven snapped his fingers, and Oda disappeared. He walked to Aiden and placed his hand on his shoulder. They teleported back to Ikijoin to pick up Megan and Charlie, then gathered their belongings before teleporting back to the Keeper mansion. Six sat in his chair and welcomed them with a hand gesture. The demons stared back at him. "We have a problem on our hands," Six said. Seven ambled to a couch as he ate candy from his paper bag. Six stood out of his chair and examined the three of them. "We left out a small detail when we had our talk with Yggdrasil. Tomorrow, the three of you must go to the Lion and Phoenix alone. You're dismissed." Megan and Charlie went home after their arduous journey. Aiden hopped into his car and drove to Beaver Cemetery. He knelt next to his father's tombstone and bowed his head. Aiden closed his eyes and made sure his posture was perfect. "I feel much more confident with my powers. It's funny how I feel like an old man now. Things have been befuddling, to say the least. I think I'm starting to love Megan. I'll carry your strength with me tomorrow. I miss you, Dad. Thank you for everything you ever did for me. Thank you for being my mom and my dad." 6 and 7 had a private meeting of their own as they watched Aiden from afar. 6 brushed his chin with his fingertips. "I have moved the stones into the correct positions. You better have played your part, Ira." "Worry not, brother," 7 replied. "This will be taken care of anon." They looked at each other with an ominous grin. Aiden hopped into his car and pulled out of the cemetery. On his way back to Sanctuary, music played out of the car stereo.